Sugar Kisses by Sarah Marks. 21st Century Austen. A prequel story. I love staying at my brother's home when visiting Lackack. It was rare since I worked in a popular restaurant in Boston, but when James and Carson invited me for dinner, I made a point of staying overnight. We would sit up all night, drinking and talking about the world. I loved it even more when Carson's sister Carrie was with us. The four of us had been friends all our lives, and now we're one family since Carson and James had gotten married. I was glad to be part of this family since our parents had died a few years ago. They lived long enough to see James and Carson get married, but they were gone soon after. My mother had a long battle with cancer, and my father had a stroke and wasn't found until after he had passed. Jean and Maureen Woodhouse had been their best friends and were quick to pull us in to take care of whatever we needed. "Everyone is coming over," James said from the doorway of the spare room as I unpacked my bag for tonight's dinner. Now that we were home, my older brother had changed out of his suit. He was in fresh sweatpants and a t-shirt, but his blonde hair was already tousled. This meant James was done being a lawyer for the day and ready to drink. I raised an eyebrow. "Who is everyone?" James shrugged. "Carrie, Jean, and Maureen. You know, the family." I recognized the unspoken cue from my brother. "Do you need help in the kitchen?" If the family was coming, James was anxious about food, and I was the chef. I suspected everything I would need for dinner was laid out in the kitchen, ready for me to take control. James' shoulders relaxed, and a broad smile spread across his face. "Please." It was easy for me to step into this role. I was used to a busy restaurant kitchen, but I loved cooking in a small kitchen for a family meal. I knew what everyone liked to eat and how it should be prepared. Carrie and James would devour anything I made without question, but Jean needed to be told how it was prepared. Carson and Maureen were the ones quick to help with the prep. That's how I found Carson when I entered the kitchen. He was already chopping the vegetables I would need. He had even put on a pot of water to boil. We fell into a natural rhythm as James set up the dining room while Carson and I cooked. My brother-in-law knew me and his kitchen well enough to have things ready when I needed them. Behind. My brother would periodically call out to let me know he was moving around the kitchen to get plates and glasses. I had taught it to him after my first restaurant job when he had gotten in my way and broken a stack of my mother's dishes. I brought wine. Carrie's voice sang through the house as she opened the door. My best friend came in wearing a cute sundress and carrying a bag of wine. I could hear the glass clinking as the bottles jostled against each other. Once she put the bag down, she came around the island to give me a hug and kiss on the cheek. "I'm so glad you're here," she said as she pulled 6 bottles of wine out of the bag. Doug helped me pick out the wines, and we couldn't decide, so I got them all. "I'm sure we'll drink them all tonight." "Did you drive over?" Carson asked. Carrie didn't answer right away. She was focused on pouring me a glass of the red wine she knew I liked and needed. She winked and rolled her eyes as she handed me the glass. "Of course, I didn't drive over. Either I'll crash here, or I'll find a ride." These were the moments I missed because I lived in Boston. I didn't want to go back to the city. As we all settled, I realized this was the most relaxed I had been in months. "The meal was wonderful, as usual, Zach," Jean said as he helped Maureen clear the table. I heard the two of them doing their best to clean up in the kitchen. Carson joined them, and they soon rejoined us with a plate full of cupcakes. When Carson put the platter down, he sat down next to James and gave him a nod. "We have some news," James said, beaming with happiness as he squeezed Carson's hand. The last time I had seen them like this, they announced their engagement. I looked at Carrie, whose eyes were wide as a smile slowly spread across her face. In that moment, I knew what they were going to announce. Carson took a deep breath and threw his arms in the air. "We're going to have a baby." It took us 10 minutes to calm down long enough to hear the details. Maureen and Jean were in tears, and Carrie went to get the tissues. "We've picked a surrogate already," James said before anyone could speak the one suggestion that probably felt natural. Carrie relaxed. Her being the surrogate had been mentioned numerous times in the past. She would get quiet and withdrawn each time it did. I knew it was because she had no desire to carry a child, but she couldn't disappoint her brother by refusing. "Who will the father be?" Jean asked, sitting back in his chair and drumming his fingers on the table. "We won't know," James said. "We will both contribute to the insemination and let fate decide." "What does this mean for your futures?" Maureen asked as she leaned into the table and put her head in her hand. "I will stop working for a few years once the baby arrives," Carson said, looking back and forth between his parents. I met Carrie's eyes, and we both braced for a fight. Carson had been open with us about how unhappy he was working in interior design, his current job. Since most of his work was in Boston, he had a long commute each day. He disliked working for wealthy people who only wanted what their neighbors had. He felt there was zero creativity in his work. James, on the other hand, was the Woodhouse family attorney. He worked locally but rarely had a consistent schedule. If Carson was willing to stay home with the babies, I was sure his job was worse than he had let on. "You know," Carrie said, perking up. "You can always help with the display windows at the stash to have some fun." Carson laughed. "I may need the break but not for free." Carrie's head bobbed vigorously. "Obviously, I'd pay you as a resident artist. We can make it a big deal to see the new window. I know the ladies at the table would be happy to help with the babies when you work," Maureen said. I thought of the aging group of women who knit in the store nearly every day. The table was a staple of the family's flagship yarn store downtown. "Are things that slow?" I asked. Carrie let out a deep sigh. "I'm trying many things to increase traffic, but it will take time." This was the most deflated I had ever seen Carrie. Her passion for the yarn store had always seemed limitless. She was always carrying around a journal to write down ideas as they came to her. Even now, I noticed her tapping her finger on the table the way she would tap her pen as she thought through an idea. I wondered what idea had come to her with the baby announcement. She met my eye and smiled when I jerked my head to the side, signifying that she should get her journal before becoming a jittery mess. She jumped up and was back in a few seconds, the journal already open and her pen scribbling on the paper. Watching her made me realize I wasn't going to be part of this child's life the way she would be. I would be stuck in a restaurant in Boston, only able to come to visit once a month if I was lucky. For a moment, I wanted to follow Carson's lead and quit my job so I could be here with them too. The next afternoon, as I rode the train back into the city, I thought about the news that I would be an uncle. I sat alone on the commuter train, dreading my return to work and thinking about what I missed in Lackac. I wanted to find a way to be in Lackac more often, but there didn't seem to be anything I could change. Later that night, at the restaurant, as my boss Jack and I cooked through dinner service, I kept getting distracted by ideas that I wasn't sure I could make happen. "How's the family?" Jack asked as they cleaned up when service was over. Jack has been patient with me through dinner, and it was clear that he was noticing something that I was still struggling with. I shrugged. Fine, I said, and then told him the baby news. Jack wiped down the walls around the stove. He wasn't looking at me, but I knew he was smiling. You know, he said. I was dealing with burnout when the kids were little. I couldn't do more in a kitchen except for cooking for them, but it allowed me to be in their lives more than my father was in mine. I thought of his kids, the oldest Lisbeth, now in college in Georgia, and his youngest Becca, almost done with high school. Josh, the middle child, was in a local university to learn about the business side of restaurants. Jack's father, Abraham, was a famous chef who still dominated the industry even though he was in his late 80s. Jack was nothing like the old man but shared his passion for food. Josh wanted a restaurant empire that he ran. I often joked that I could run one of those restaurants, but the last day made me rethink that plan. I'm a little jealous that Carrie will get to be around all the time, I said with a deep sigh. Is the store still struggling? My boss asked. I gave him a half smile. She's trying things. Even last night, she was full of ideas. Jack had met Carrie plenty of time to know exactly what I meant. What that town needs is tourism, he said. A highway runs right by it, and there are so many lovely spots in town. We still like to go in when we visit my in-laws. There's some type of plan to make it a spa town or an artist community, I said. They keep trying to pull the Woodhouse family into the argument. There's nothing good to eat there. They need a place with sandwiches and soups for lunch, Jack added. A place where commuters can work or people can sit to catch up with each other. I barked a laugh. It would eventually turn into a sub and pizza place. Jack shook his head. I'm serious. We always want something fresh when we walk downtown. There's that weird candy store and some Chinese restaurants, but there are no cafes. Are you going to give up the restaurant and move out to Lackack to do this? I asked. Jack laughed for a few moments and cut himself off. You should do it. I shook my head and laughed at him. I'm serious, Zach, he said before I stopped. You're close to burning out, and you need to focus on what makes you happy. Being at home would make you happen, and I can help you finance it as an investor. I kept shaking my head. It would take forever to find the right space and renovate it. Jack started nodding his head, and soon his whole body was bouncing with energy. Carrie has all that unused room in the yarn shop, and I bet there's a kitchen somewhere. This was something Jack had been thinking about. What had my mentor already planned? I thought about the stash and the wealth of poorly used space. There was a gas and water line, from what I remembered. There was a small kitchen the staff used as a break room with a stove. I had learned to dye yarn in that kitchen one weekend as a child, and my mother and Maureen had made a mess and nearly set the room on fire. They've started using some of that space for processing online orders, I told him. I'm sure if you talk to Carrie about it, she'll like the idea. I'm willing to bet she's already had the idea, and it's in one of her journals, Jack said. Have her come out, and we can put a plan together. I left the restaurant and walked to my apartment. The idea was in my head now. It started as a back-and-forth argument about this being a good idea, but soon I came up with menu plans and decor ideas. I suddenly understood how Carrie felt when she had an idea in her head and had to get it on paper. I sat on my sofa with a beer and a pad of paper. 3 hours later, I had a complete menu and sketches of what the cafe would look like. The stash was on the corner of the building with doors on both sides. The side entrance was perfect for a cafe without disrupting the store. It would take a while to renovate, but it would increase traffic, just like Carrie wanted. It's been forever since I had dinner in the city, Carrie said when I met her at the tea stop by the restaurant a week later. Were things that quiet at the store? I asked. Carrie shrugged. Teresa can keep things under control. Are the ideas still not having an impact? She shook her head. The sales are great, and people come for events, but it's dead in the store when nothing's going on. I could appreciate how frustrating this was for Carrie. It wasn't about the money and sales for Carrie. She was an extrovert and craved a community. In the week since Jack and I had started working on this, I had focused on my ideas on how a cafe would give Carrie the community she currently lacked. I knew that was the secret to getting her to agree. Once at the restaurant, I brought her back to the kitchen, where Jack and I had made a sample of the menu I wanted. The restaurant was closed that night, so nobody would interrupt us. Carrie licked her lips and sat down at a table we kept back there for staff meals or when we had visitors. I have a proposal for you, I said as I brought the first plate to her. Carrie lifted her chin and rubbed her hands together. She had been like this in college when I had come for culinary school, and she was in college. I could always count on her to be ready to eat anything I made. It was something I loved about her. You can have whatever you want, she said, picking up her fork and putting her napkin on her lap. I put down the breakfast frittata and let her dig in. I watched as Carrie's eyes rolled, and she let out a little moan of pleasure. You don't want to hear the proposal first? I asked and sat down at the table with her. Instead of talking, she rolled her hand, signaling me to continue. I want to open a cafe in the stash. Carrie stopped chewing and swallowed. My store? The stash? I nodded, and Jack brought the next plate of food with a homemade breakfast sandwich, including fresh sausage. He put it down next to the frittata, and Carrie's eyes got big as a smile spread across her face. You would make this food in a cafe in my store? She asked as she cut the sandwich in half, abandoning the frittata, and took a bite. This time she closed her eyes as she chewed. I have an investor, I said and put my hand on Jack's shoulder. And a plan that James asked an architect to design. Jack opened the folder that we had put off to the side. In it were the plans from the architect to show how we would build the cafe without interrupting the yarn store. You did all of this without me? Carrie asked between bites. I wondered if she was impressed or jealous for not getting to do it herself. Is that a problem? Carrie shrugged. I like this a lot, but are you ready to give up your dreams here? That threw me off. I was expecting her to ask about the budget and timelines. That my dreams were her first concern reminded me that, first and foremost, this woman was my best friend and knew me better than anyone. We've been talking about that recently, Jack said when it was clear I was overwhelmed by Carrie's question. It had been Jack who noticed my change in energy once we started this plan. He also noticed how my heart didn't seem to be in this restaurant anymore. He had used the word burnout, and while I wasn't there yet, I was on the path. I came and did my job without complaint. I simply didn't have the passion for this life anymore. With all the changes coming to my family, I didn't like being an hour away from them. I wanted to be in Lackac. It's time for me to move on before I burn out, I said and met Carrie's eyes. She held my gaze for a few moments. Tell me what you need from me, she said. My favorite part of this process is the menu planning, Carrie said 2 months later. We were sitting in her apartment, above the stash, with Umberto. I had hired him a few days before but wanted Carrie to taste some of his pastries. He was going to be making all of them and our bread. The apartment smelled of baking sugar and butter as we waited for a batch of cranberry scones to come out of the oven. This was the second item he was sampling for Carrie. We were already eating breakfast sandwiches with English muffins he had made while the scones were baking. With my fresh sausage, eggs from Jean Woodhouse's farm, and cheese from Jack's connection in the area, these were the best sandwiches I had ever eaten. "We should do our best to make sure all the food is sourced locally," she said and wrote something down on the journal she always had with her. "I have a few things in the works. Jack's in-laws live in Gardner, so they've been accommodating with connections." "That's how I got the cheese," I said. "Not everything will be easy to source locally," Umberto added as he mixed whatever he was baking next. I was pretty sure it was Tres Leches cake since that had been the cake I tasted when I discovered him. Carrie nodded. "We'll do what we can." There was a knock at her door, and our brothers joined us for the tasting. They looked giddy with excitement and giggled as they sat to taste the sandwiches waiting for them. "What's going on?" Carrie asked, putting her pen down and giving them her full attention. Our brothers kept giggling. "We know the sex," Carson said and put his hand over his mouth to stifle a laugh. Carrie and I exchanged confused looks. "Are you going to tell us?" I asked. "A boy," Carson said. "And a girl," James added. Carrie's eyebrows knit together. "Twins." "We're having twins," our brothers said in unison. "Oh my God!" Carrie yelled as she jumped out of her seat and threw her arms around them. This was why I was home. I was excited to be part of this and not an hour away, waiting for the news in a phone call while I rushed around a kitchen. I found a bottle of champagne in the fridge, and we all toasted to our two newest additions. As we ate and drank, I kept looking at Carrie. It dawned on me that I was in love with her. It wasn't sudden, having built up over years in each other's lives. I had gone to culinary school in Boston to be close to her. Moving back here and building the cafe was more about her than anything else. The menu I was building was full of her favorite foods or things made the way she loved them. The sausage blend was one I had developed for her as teenagers when I first learned to cook. Learning to cook was even a way to make her happy since food always made Carrie Woodhouse happy. I wanted to kiss her, but I held back. I needed to find the right way to tell her because I was sure she felt the same way, even if she hadn't seen it yet.